So, the company formerly known as Facebook is having a rough go of things lately. The social media giant is being forced to sell one of its recent purchases. A former staffer turned whistleblower will testify on Capitol Hill again. And now the head of digital payments is quitting. So, where does this leave the company now known as Meta? Here with more on Meta's ongoing challenges is David Kirkpatrick. He is founder of Techonomy Media. David is the author of The Facebook Effect and therefore is my go-to on all things Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. David, always a pleasure to speak with you. I want to get straight to the news here, which is David Marcus, one of the company's top executives, will be leaving Facebook turned Meta at the end of the year. What do we need to know about David Marcus and why is this significant?
Well, thanks, and love to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. David Marcus is one of the most impressive people at Facebook. It's a major loss. He was leading a project that is extremely important to the company, most recently creating a digital wallet for all of Facebook's 3.5 billion customer users. He is very, very well respected throughout the industry. He's a longtime entrepreneur. He was president of PayPal before coming to Facebook, so he was a very prominent hire, even when he joined in 2014. He's somebody who some of us have even thought could theoretically be CEO of Facebook someday under some circumstances, which are unlikely. But he's that kind of heavy hitter.
So he's that kind of heavy hitter. You mentioned that he came over to Facebook from PayPal. He also ran the Messenger service, which was clearly a priority for Mark Zuckerberg for a while. I know this is like asking you to speculate, but how much do you think this is tied to Mark Zuckerberg running the company as his own personal playground because he has all voting rights control over the company and perhaps people that he brought in to really professionalize the managerial ranks may be getting fed up with that? Or am I reading too much into this and making a story out of something that's not there?
I think the realities of Facebook invite us to read a lot into things like this. I mean, after all, he's at least the third major high-profile departure this year. Carolyn Everson, who was the head of sales, David Fisher, who was the head of revenue, both have also left very recently. And, there's no question Facebook is a unique giant company in the degree to which one person wields all power. And considering that he's done a lot of things that many of us question, first of all, not sufficiently remediating a range of harms, which have been proven in the Facebook papers, endless releases of leaked documents, a month or so, as well as changing the company's name in what seems to many a very whimsical sort of way, very much based on his own personal interests. I could easily see how a serious leader like David Marcus could say, I'm never going to have the influence I want here. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Right. I want to bring up what you were saying about the digital payments effort that David Marcus was leading. It's called Diem, and of course it used to be called Libra, so there are many different names for this project. It never actually launched. Why is that? Facebook has a thriving marketplace. I mean, a lot of people buy secondhand furniture on Facebook Marketplace. They use Venmo to complete the transaction. They don't use any kind of digital coin created by Facebook. Why has this Facebook coin, digital coin, not made any traction, do you think?
Well, I think it hasn't made traction primarily because Facebook is not trusted by anybody who pays close attention, but especially by government leaders around the world who would have to either passively accept it or regulatorily, approve it. That has proven much, much more difficult than they expected. I don't think they really wanted to acknowledge, even when they first launched the Libra project a couple of years ago, how untrustworthy they were felt to be by government officials around the world, especially in the United States, but everywhere. So they've had a big problem with credibility. That's one part of it. I don't think they're going to give up, however. And Novi is slightly different than Libra, which was renamed Diem, which is now outside of Facebook's total control. And that is the currency effort. Novi, which Marcus was leading, is the wallet that would hold digital currencies, which is a separate but closely related effort.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. It can get kind of confusing, but all
It
I
is
know,
confusing.
yeah,
Crypto's always confusing, especially when it comes from the one, one of the most powerful companies in the world that's doing it
right.
for its own personal interests.
Right. And of course, it hasn't gotten off the ground either. You mentioned distrust, and that's a theme that is very prominent this week as well, because UK regulators have ordered Facebook to sell Giffy, which is a GIF search engine that it turns out Facebook bought in 2020, but never actually got regulators' approval for. The regulators in the UK cited antitrust concerns that the purchase would attract more users to Facebook's many different platforms, or I should say Meta's many different platforms. What's significant here, David, is this is the first time a major regulator has forced a Silicon Valley giant to divest a purchase that it has already completed. What's your take on this?
Well, it is very significant as a precedent, partly because in the United States, the FTC is suing Facebook and threatening to possibly try to separate Instagram and WhatsApp, which are also long ago completed mergers, much further back than Giffy. I mean, Giffy was, or is it Jiffy? I can never get that one right.
I can't figure it out either.
But in any case, that was a deal done in May of last year and completed. Now, the British regulatory authorities in June issued an order that Facebook should stop integrating the service in order to allow them to further assess whether it was a competitive harm, whether it was marketplace harm in doing that. And then in October, the British regulators fined Facebook £50 million because Facebook was not cooperating with them enough in their efforts to review the competitive implications of the Giffy acquisition. And they said at the time it was unprecedented that any company would have resisted their efforts to the degree that Facebook did. And in the history of that agency, the highest fine they'd ever given to anybody in the past was £365,000. So they've already been really angry at Facebook, and but it could be a precedent. Other governments are going to try to do similar things.
Yeah, and that's the big question, right? You mentioned Instagram. Is Instagram next? If Facebook can unwind a purchase it made last year and regulators are looking further back, what are the odds that a regulator, whether it's the UK one or those in the US, would force Facebook to divest Instagram?
I think the odds that they would successfully force them to divest it are very small. And I think Facebook's going to fight this thing in the UK very hard. They have unlimited resources, as we know, 40 billion in after-tax profit roughly this year. So I don't think they're going to roll over and just divest Giffy. I think they will, if only because they don't want the precedent. So if they were to say, yes, okay, it's not a big deal. It's a bunch of gifts. We can let somebody else own that. But once they agreed to do that, then it sort of empowers the FTC it legitimizes the FTC's effort to potentially split off Instagram and WhatsApp. So I think you'll see them fighting this bitterly. And they would not, and if Instagram were ever attempted in the same way, they would fight that even more bitterly. They would do everything in their power to fight it.
It would open the floodgates, essentially. The third bit of news, and this is linked in a way to what's going on with regulators, is that Frances Haugen, the former employee turned whistleblower, will be testifying again before Congress. She's going to speak before the House subcommittee on Section 230, which is basically the liability shield for tech platforms that kind of protects them because they're just a platform. They don't have editorial control over what happens on their platform. I feel like for Facebook, for Meta, this is kind of death by 1,000 cuts. Every time Frances Haugen gets up there and talks about what she's seen and what she's experienced at the company, it just chips away at the whatever goodwill Facebook has before regulators and before policymakers.
Well, she's chipping away at it in a lot of different ways because through her very closely coordinated PR effort, she was doling out and still, I think, is doling out documents of the 10,000 that she took with her when she left Facebook to this consortium of journalists who are poring over that with each week's set of releases. So they've very cleverly continued that and made it an ongoing pain for Facebook, very deep pain. And a lot of very disturbing revelations have emerged from those documents. Section 230, one thing I will say is that Frances Haugen is not deeply respected by anybody outside of possibly Congress for her regulatory ideas. She is not a regulation expert. She is an inside person who was charged with helping to remediate harms and was frustrated that they were not sufficiently remediated. So she left with all these documents in protest. But, Section 230 is a complex issue about whether or not speech should be controlled, whether these companies, internet platforms, ought to have responsibility for the content that is posted by users. And of course, she'll say that they ought to have more responsibility. I doubt, and it will make Facebook more embarrassed, no question. But I don't think it would have a huge impact on that debate that she personally is testifying, except in that it may further embarrass the company in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, death by a thousand cuts. It doesn't need to actually have the effect immediately, but over time it kind of corrodes what is there. David, I look at the share price of Facebook, and over the past 1 year, it's fallen, or I should say it's lagged behind the S&P 500 by 10 percentage points, which is significant given how the other technology companies, the FANG stocks, have done fairly well, which have outperformed the S&P 500 by 5 percentage points. All this is to say that Facebook has underperformed its tech peers and has not done as well as the broader market. What does the company do moving forward? I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, as you mentioned, seems to be pivoting the company in the direction of his own interest, the metaverse, rather than kind of paying attention and taking stock of the overall public opinion of his firm and how users are responding to it, how advertisers might be changing their view of it. Maybe they're not changing their view, but what are the conversations that are likely happening inside Facebook? Or do those conversations not happen because it's Mark Zuckerberg's company?
Well, the last thing you just said is probably the closest to the truth. It's not that conversations don't happen, but one, despot, autocrat, corporate autocrat makes those decisions, and he seems almost always very unflappable and not concerned about public perception, especially these days. He used to be more concerned, it would seem. So it's really hard to say what is going on inside that company. Many of us really wonder whether Sheryl Sandberg might be feeling either very unhappy with his decision-making or very marginalized by him as he's taken even more all-powerful authority. There is no question that the stock price is a disappointment, but it's still gone up a lot. It just hasn't gone up as much as certain other stocks, which are extraordinary high flyers in a historic manner. So it's Google, Microsoft, Apple, these stocks nothing's like that's ever been seen before. It's a tough comparison. Facebook's still a very valuable company whose stock in general has performed very well. And I think for Zuckerberg, that's enough. It may be for some of his employees who are compensated by stock options, it is not enough. And that even could be a problem for somebody like David Marcus. We don't know.
Right. So final question to you, David. You mentioned that Facebook Meta will be fighting a lot of the issues here, whether it's UK regulators ordering it to sell Giffy, certainly on the defensive when it comes to David Marcus departing. What is Facebook's next move? What is Mark Zuckerberg's next move? Is it to still be in reaction mode, to be defensive? Or what is the company going to do to stay on the offensive?
They're going to try to stay on the offensive. That's their current mode. They used to be much more defensive. Remember when he used to apologize for things, multiple times? He doesn't do that anymore. He basically, thumbs his nose at regulators, the press, dissident employees, and even to some extent the public, because he believes that Facebook is basically a great service that's doing wonderful things for its users. So I think he's going to make aggressive moves towards metaverse functionality, whatever he thinks that is, continue really doubling down on the hardware side of Facebook, which not just with the goggles, but also speakers and other things that are actually not doing badly. And I think he may just tolerate really important people continuing to leave. The big problem he has is that he can't recruit the best people as easily as he used to be able to. He's basically got to pay much higher salaries that he wants to pay. Yeah. And if he pays a couple $1 million, he can get any developer. but they need the top developers in the world to come there, to keep flowing there. And that's a problem they're facing, and they're losing that battle to Google, Microsoft, Apple, even Salesforce, Oracle, et cetera. People don't want to work at Facebook. That's possibly their biggest single problem right now.
Interesting. In many ways, then, Facebook or Meta is like any other company, any other bank that's kind of struggling to retain talent. David, thank you so much, as always. David Kirkpatrick is founder of Techonomy Media and author of The Facebook Effect.